Okay, so we we left off yesterday with a question. We've got the Rambam telling us that every single person has to have love for every single fellow Jew. Part of that is that we have a responsibility to speak praise of our fellow Jew. That's what the Rambam says in chapter 5 of Hilchos Deos, the laws of human conduct. And then he tells us in chapter 6 about a Talmid Chacham, a Torah scholar who's supposed to be the epitome of the Jewish community, the individual who sets the bar of how you're supposed to behave, etc. So he says that the Talmid Chacham, the Torah scholar, always speaks praise of his fellow Jew and never speaks about his disgrace at all. So the two questions that we ended with yesterday were, why would the Rambam have to tell us that a Torah scholar speaks well of his fellow Jew if he's already told us that everybody's supposed to behave that way? So if the ordinary folk are supposed to behave that way, you certainly expect that that's how the leadership is going to behave, the spiritual leadership. The second question is, how come when he addresses an ordinary person, the Rambam just says that part of your requirement to care about another person is to speak about them positively? But when you get to the Talmid Chacham, who's supposed to be so advanced, then we also say, and don't speak negatively. You should be telling me that, not him. We're the guys who have to be reminded not to speak negatively about other people, and the Talmid Chacham surely does not need that reminder. So those are the two questions that we left off with yesterday. Now, the easy way to attempt to answer this is to say you've got to look at the angle that the Rambam comes from when he addresses the regular audience and when he addresses the advanced audience, because perhaps the angle is what's most important. You see, when he speaks about the mitzvah, v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, let's think about this for a second. There's a mitzvah to love your fellow Jew as yourself. What's the most important part of that mitzvah? Is the most important part how I behave? Or is the most important part what you get from my behavior? In other words, if I'm told that I have to love every single Jew, is the emphasis that what I have to do, or is the emphasis that the Jew should feel loved? Which would you say? Well, what would you say is the emphasis in that mitzvah? And just to be clear, very often when we analyze what a mitzvah is, we ask the question, is the mitzvah about my behavior, or is the mitzvah about the effect that's supposed to happen beyond myself? For example, let's use an example. If I'm going to try and use an example that's a little bit related both to this scenario and also to what we're still going to learn further. If the Torah tells me that I'm not supposed to speak Lashon Hara, is the most important thing that I don't speak Lashon Hara? Or is the most important thing that other people don't get harmed by people spreading stories about them? What's the focus? The focus on the speaker, or is the focus on the individual who's going to be the subject of the conversation?
One is an extension of the other. If you don't say anything, you can't offend
Okay, so if I don't say anything, he's not going to be hurt. So that's why. Am I not allowed to say anything because it's bad for me, or because it's bad for him?
both.
You can't choose both. You have to pick a side over here. Right? You got to pick a side.
I'd say it's bad for him.
It's bad for him, right?
But slander kills three.
We're going to, like I said, this is relevant to something we're going to speak about. So we're going to get to that point. But just to understand the concept, just from our own perspective, not quoting any source, the danger of Lashon Hara is to the victim. In other words, the fact that I shouldn't speak Lashon Hara is much more about the fact that another person shouldn't get hurt than about the fact that I shouldn't speak negatively. Again, there's an element of I shouldn't speak negatively too. When the Rambam introduces this law, that you should love your fellow Jew as yourself, we immediately imagine that the focus of this mitzvah is that the individual should get my love. The individual should be treated well. Okay? So therefore, when the Rambam speaks about how you love your fellow Jew, it makes sense that the Rambam should include in that, speak positively about that person, because that's going to benefit the person. You're going to speak positively about them. When he gets to the next chapter, which is describing the behavior and conduct of a Talmid Chacham, of a Torah scholar, so at that point, the Rambam is not speaking about the impact that he's going to have on other people, although that is part of the benefit. if the Talmud Chacham behaves in the way that he should, society will benefit from that. But that's not the focus of that chapter. The focus of that chapter is you want to be a Talmud Chacham. You want to be a scholar. You want to be the spiritual elite. In that case, part of your growth is that you've got to speak well of other people. It's a different angle. It's a different context. In that context, then we're not only talking about the benefit to the person, we're talking about the level of care that you have to take about how you speak. So in that context, we say, not only should you speak positively, but you should avoid speaking negatively as well. We're talking about how you should behave, not so much about what benefit comes to the person. So that'd be the easiest way to answer this question. Problem is, it doesn't really answer the question. Let's be honest, it doesn't really answer the question. Why not? Because again, why would you suspect that the Torah scholar is inclined to speak badly about somebody else and therefore has to be warned, don't speak negatively about them? Again, you'd expect that ordinary people need to have that caveat, not a Torah scholar. But let's take it one step further. If you're teaching somebody how to behave, let's just say, whatever it is, a parent, a child, a teacher, in whatever role it is that you're responsible to teach somebody how to behave, what would you say if you've got two things you've got to teach them? The one is speak positively about somebody else. The other is don't speak negatively about them. How would you order it? In other words, which one would you say first? Which one would you say first? Let's say the negative, right? Let's say you want to tell children how to behave, right? So you got two little kids, and there's a bunch of toys, and the kids, needless to say, are fighting over the toys. So what's the first thing you're going to tell them? Don't grab the toy from your sibling, cousin, friend, whatever the case is. And then you're going to tell them, not only should you not grab the toy that they have, you should share the toy that you have. But if they're busy pulling the toy away, now's not the time to tell them, give them what you've got. So don't take it away. Likewise, what are we more concerned about? Are we more concerned that somebody might speak negatively about another person? Or are we more concerned that they might not praise them? Which is the bigger issue here? Surely the bigger issue is, don't speak bad. So therefore you'd expect that the Rambam would tell us that Talmud Chacham, who apparently is the person we have to address this issue with, don't speak negatively about your fellow Jew. In addition to that, share their praises. But the Rambam does the opposite. He says, share the praise of your fellow Jew, and, what do you mean and? I'm already sharing the praise. And don't speak badly about him. How does that work logically? I'm already speaking positively about him. I'm already praising him. So why are you adding to that? And don't speak negatively. Doesn't seem to flow logically. So as you always have to do when you're trying to learn something in Torah, you always have to step back and understand the context, especially when you're learning the Rambam, because the Rambam tells us that the way that he structured his series of laws was to build concepts on earlier concepts. So you've always got to say, what did he teach us before this? Because that will give us the insight into what he's teaching us now. So what he teaches us immediately before this is a principle which we know from Pirkei Avos, very easy to talk about, extremely difficult to do. And that is the principle, Haveidon es kol ha'adam lechaf zchus. Now there's a translation of that, and then as we're going to learn, there is a more nuanced translation. So let's do the regular translation. Haveidon es kol ha'adam lechaf zchus. Everybody will translate that as judge people favorably. Judge people favorably. Easy to say, right? Is it easy to do? To judge people favorably? Not so simple. Because when do you actually have to be told to judge somebody favorably? Let's think about it. Under what circumstances are you going to have to be reminded that you have to judge a person favorably? Let's say, for argument's sake, after shul, somebody makes you a coffee. Do you have to judge them favorably?
Or to say thank you.
To say thank you. Why do you have to judge them favorably? This is great. This is amazing. You're a wonderful person. You did something for me that I appreciate. Whatever. I don't have to judge you favorably. So where do you have to judge a person favorably? There's an implication in the statement itself. Where do you have to judge a
Don't
person
tell me
favorably?
in court.
Not in court.
Ulterior motive.
When, in other words, when you're already judging them. That's when you have to be told to judge a person favorably. If you're not judging a person, why do we have to be advised? Judge them favorably. So the implication of judge a person favorably is that there's a situation that for whatever reason is prompting you to judge them unfavorably, and therefore we have to be told, according to Torah, judge them favorably. So let's use an example. What's an example?
Must be a Jewish person.
Doesn't matter. In this context, doesn't matter, right? So, what's an example? So here's an example. Okay, I'm sure there's dozens of examples we could think of. Here's an example. A person tells you, I will definitely be there at whatever it is that you've invited them to. So in my case, the guy says, I'll definitely be at Mincha this evening. In your case, maybe it's the person who, you're trying to put together some kind of a program, a project, an event. The person says, I'll definitely be there. Comes the time of the event. Nobody, nothing, not answering the calls, forget about it. So what goes through your mind? You start judging the guy. So unreliable, he's dishonest, can't keep his word, stood me up, and all that kind of stuff. So it's in that situation that the Torah will tell you have to judge a person favorably. Maybe something happened, maybe he's stuck in traffic, maybe his cell phone battery died. You've got to judge the person favorably. In fact, the Gemara even tells a story about the fellow who was trying to collect tzedakah. And he went to a very wealthy man. And he asked the wealthy man for contribution. And the wealthy man told him, I can't help you. And he said, okay, that's fine. And he left. About a week or so later, the wealthy man comes to him, gives him a massive contribution to the cause that he was fundraising for. And then he says to him, Sanu, you obviously must have been very annoyed at me when you came last week and you asked me for money, and I told you I can't give money. So the fellow says, no, I wasn't annoyed at all. He says, what do you mean you weren't annoyed? He says, I just assumed. I assumed that you just you didn't have liquidity at that point. You have many assets, and I assumed that all of your cash was invested in your various business. The Gemara goes through a whole lot of different examples about it. That he had investments overseas and whatever, like all different. But the point was that he just assumed that the guy had tied up all of his liquid assets into investments, and he couldn't. So he didn't judge it. So the guy then doubled his donation. So because he anticipated, first he wanted to contribute, so he contributed, but he anticipated that the guy would have been irritated with him and thought that he's a miser and he's disinterested, etc., etc. The other guy judged him favorably. That's what we're supposed to do. We're supposed to judge a person favorably. Now, those are examples of things that affect us directly, right? You were supposed to come and you didn't come. I asked you for money, you didn't contribute. But there's another area where we judge people, and that is when we see individuals who behave in a way that is misaligned with Judaism. Then we start to judge them. What's with that person? Is that the way that a Jewish person should behave? Is that an affront person on top of it? How could they do that? How could they behave this way? So they discredit the entire Jewish people. Or if you want the most extreme case, we talk about the self-hating Jew. These are the people who should need to be excised from the community, excommunicated. Nobody should have anything to do with them. They cause us more damage than anybody else. We without realizing it, spend a lot of our time judging people. So what does the Rambam tell us? You have to judge a person favorably. But where does he tell us that? Not so much in the context of the ordinary person, specifically in the context of the Torah scholar. Why? Because the Torah scholar is the individual who is more likely to be sensitive to a person behaving in a way that's not aligned with Torah, because this is what he cares about. He cares about Judaism, he cares about Torah, he cares about the observance of mitzvahs. So he's the person who's going to get riled up when somebody's not doing those things, not caring about those things. So we're addressing him and saying, you have to know You have to judge everybody favorably. Now we can start to understand a little bit of the context of what the Rambam is telling us. An ordinary person, your job is to speak well of other people. A scholar, somebody who is, in a sense, responsible for the community. Somebody who has, who's got to keep an eye out that people behave in the way that they should. That's the person who has a higher chance of being critical of somebody who's not behaving right. So we tell him, not only should you speak positively about another person, but don't speak about their disgrace at all. Because you're the guy who's going to notice it. You're the person who knows the halacha. You're the person who knows how a Jew is supposed to behave. So you're the one who's going to be most sensitive to noticing, to nitpicking, to identifying what it is that a person's doing wrong. So therefore we tell you it's not good enough for you to speak positively and praise everybody. You've actually got to be on guard that you don't ever highlight what they're doing wrong. Let's take it a step further. When the Rambam addresses this Talmud Chacham, he says that if you are a Talmud Chacham, what's going to distinguish you from ordinary people is your wisdom. Because that's what a Talmud Chacham is, a scholar, a person who has tremendous Torah wisdom. So anybody who meets this Torah scholar will know straight away, wow, look at this person, they know so much. One of the worst things that can happen is when you've got somebody who knows so much, who's clearly so learned in Torah, but their behavior does not impress people. That's a bad story. And what happens when a person's behavior is misaligned with their knowledge is that other people get turned off from that knowledge. It's all very well that this person is so learned, etc., but they don't give me the time of day, they don't speak nicely, they don't treat their family well, or whatever the case is. So therefore the Rambam goes through a list of 10 different areas of life where a Torah scholar is also not only supposed to conduct themselves well, but is supposed to stand out. In the same way as the Torah scholar stands out in terms of their knowledge, they have to stand out in terms of their conduct in 10 different areas. Just to give you a few of the examples, the way he speaks. That's going to be relevant to our conversation, so I'll come back to that in a second. The way he dresses. That a Torah scholar should look good, should look put together, shouldn't look like a tramp. The way that he eats. Right? That the Torah scholar should not stuff his face. The way he conducts his business. In fact, the Gemara goes through some very interesting examples where the Gemara says that if a Torah scholar borrows money and does not repay immediately, forget about within the time frame, he doesn't repay it immediately, that's unbecoming. It's not a way that he should behave, etc. Various other ideas. So one of the things that the Rambam says is diburoi benachas im habrios, that he has to speak gently to people. In other words, speak in a way that is reserved, in a way that is refined, and in a way that is sensitive. That's something that's specific to a Torah scholar. Now, is it ideal for everybody? Of course, everybody should ideally speak in a way that is sensitive. But if you're a Torah scholar, the stakes are higher, and so you have to be very cautious that the way that you speak is very sensitive. So now you know this, everybody at the table, you have to be much more careful how you speak, because people are going to look at you and say, you're a Torah scholar, and how could you speak this way? He has to speak gently or sensitively with every person. Now, one of the mitzvahs in the Torah, in fact, we just read it in the parasha this past Shabbos, and it's ironically in the same context as where the Torah tells us to love our fellow Jew. See, everybody thinks that love your fellow Jew is, just kind of lay it on thick and treat everybody with that's true. But part of the mitzvah to love your fellow Jew includes what the Torah calls hoicheach toichiach es amisecha, which means that if you see somebody is doing something which is not in alliance with the Torah, in alignment with the Torah, you have to point him out.
To him.
You've got to point him out to himself. I'm just going to go over to the person and say, Reb Yid, listen here, I just want you to know that what you're doing is not what the Torah says. And when the Torah gives us instruction, it gives us with a double expression. Hoicheach toichiach. Rashi tells us at any time that the Torah uses a double expression, it means you've got to keep doing this until you get through to him. So you've got to keep going. You keep reminding the person, hello, this is not how a Jewish person behaves. Okay? Now, let's analyze this principle, because there are different ways that a person could do this. You could be very rough, or you could be very subtle. You could be very direct, and you go over to the person and say, Reb Yid, this is not how Jews behave. This is not. For example, I'm sure you've had this experience in one form or another. You're davening and your tefillin's a little bit skew. Somebody comes over to you. There's two options now of what they do. The one option is they could tell you just move your tefillin a little bit to the center. The other option is they could tell you, if your tefillin are not in the center, you're not even fulfilling the mitzvah. So the one's a more rough approach. The other one's a more subtle approach. Right? I'll give you another example. So let's say you go to a community, not like ours, and there happens not to be an Eruv. Now, there are very few frum communities in today's world that don't have an Eruv, but there still remain. There's some communities, even on principle, that don't have an Eruv. So it's Shabbos. You walk in the street, you're carrying your talis bag to shul, because where you come from, there's an Eruv, and where you are now, there's no Eruv. So somebody comes over to you and they say, listen, I don't want to make you feel uncomfortable. Just want to let you know there's no Eruv in this area. Or alternatively, a person can come over to you and could say, hello, stop, don't move. You can't carry on walking. Don't you know there's no Eruv? Okay, two different approaches. In fact, I'll tell you a story that happened to me when I was a kid. I was walking, I was literally a kid, and I was walking in a frum area, and I just bought an ice cream. So I was walking down the street eating the ice cream. And an older man walked past, and he said, Ha'oichel bashuk, doime, then he paused for dramatic effect, lemelech, which is a paraphrase of a line in the Gemara. The Gemara says, Ha'oichel bashuk, a person who eats in the street, doime lekelev, is compared to a dog. This guy said this, but he changed the last word. So he said a person who eats in the street is compared to a king. So I got the message, But he did it in a way that was subtle. It was gentle. Not to say you're like a dog because eating the street. It's like, what do you think, you're royalty? That you could just eat wherever you want. It's like a subtle way of expressing the same message. Here's what the Rambam is telling us. The Rambam is telling us that every single one of us has a responsibility to praise our fellow Jew wherever we can. That's a universal responsibility. When it comes to pointing out that somebody is doing something wrong, the ordinary person might say it in a subtle way. They might say it in a direct or even abrasive way. If an ordinary person is a little bit abrasive in their treatment of somebody else, it's bad, but it's not going to be devastating. But if you're a Torah scholar, and you now have to point out what somebody else is doing wrong, you have to be sure that Einoi Masapre Bignosoi Klal, that there's nothing in your approach that makes the person feel harmed. Nothing, not even at the most subtle, because you're a Torah scholar. So what you say has gravitas. And when you're going to speak to a person and point out, and you're the person who's most likely to notice where they're going wrong, you have to be so cautious that you don't say anything that could in any way be inflammatory. That's the Rambam's message. That's why he says, speak positively first, because that's a universal experience. This degree of self-audit, to ensure that the way you say something is so subtle and so gentle, that's specifically for the Torah scholar, because the impact it might have on another person. Now the question for us is, maybe we're not at that level yet of being a Torah scholar. We've already identified that the parasha this week, Emor, is teaching us how to speak to and about other people. So we've identified how that applies to the Torah scholar. We really need to understand how it applies to us. We're still going to use the Torah scholar as the bar, as the model of how we should behave, but we'll walk out of this with a very powerful lesson about how we're supposed to speak about and to other people, not only because it's good for us, but because of the impact that it has on those other people, which either goes to your point that you said before, that Lashon Hara affects 3 people, so that's on the negative side. We have to see how that works on the positive side as well. So that's what we'll round up, please God, next time.
Thank you.